everyone, and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. The museum is the national home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who have served in it. There are many ways to support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate, or become a member where you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. So today I am delighted to welcome Alice Hunt. Alice is a professor of early modern literature and history at the University of Southampton. She has previously written about the Tudors and James I and is the author of The Drama of Coronation, Medieval Ceremony in Early Modern England, and Republic, Britain's Revolutionary Decade, 1649 to 1660. And Alice will be signing copies of Republic after this talk. So after this talk, I'll whisk her upstairs to our bookshop where she will be signing copies. Today, Alice will examine the tumultuous impact of the British Civil Wars and ask the question, how did England's Republican experiment change the course of British history? So there will be time for questions at the end of this discussion for both our online and in-person audience. For our online audience, please place it in the chat bar, and these will be put to our speaker at the end of the talk. Moving on to some technical points. Should we encounter any technical issues, please bear with us while we work to rectify them. If your stream freezes, we suggest that you click the refresh button at the top of the browser. That usually cures all ills. A member of our team will be active in the chat bar to assist you should you have any issues or queries. With that all said, I will now pass on over to Alice and hope you all enjoyed today's talk. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you everyone for coming and to everyone online. It's wonderful to see such a packed room. I wish my lectures on this subject were as well attended. Perhaps that's all going to change. I really feel like the 17th century is having a moment, and particularly the middle decades of the 17th century and the period of the Republic. So it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about my book, Republic, which tells the story of the only time in the history of this country that Britain has been a republic, the first and only time. It tells the story of what happened in England, Scotland and Ireland after the execution of Charles I in January 1649, after the years of civil war that ended with the king being put on trial and then executed. It tells the story of the lives of those politicians and soldiers, Oliver Cromwell being the best known, of course, who, once Charles was dead and the scaffold on Whitehall dismantled, retreated to Whitehall to work out how to rule a country without a king. My book is also about those who resisted what was happening, including Charles Stuart, Charles I's eldest son, and the future Charles II, plotting his comeback from exile on the continent. It is also about those who wanted England to be far more republican than it ended up being, such as the thorn in the Republic's side, the leveller John Lilburne, but also the fiercely intellectual poet and government employee John Milton, whose amazing poem Paradise Lost arose like a phoenix from the ashes of the dying Republic at the end of the decade. At the same time, many ordinary men and women adapted to their new world and seized the opportunities that a revolutionary world could offer. Some reacted to the climate of change and experimentation by thinking in new ways and looking at the world in new ways. My book is about them too. I wrote the book because I wanted to understand what the period of the Republic was really like. I wanted to write about the 1650s as a decade in its own right, often treated as a coda to the Civil Wars. There are many, many books about the Civil Wars, and the Republic is sort of added on. Recently, there have been a few more books which are concentrating on the decade as a decade in its own right, its own time, and I welcome that. And I wanted to tell that story as clearly as possible. I didn't think that there was enough wasn't enough of a kind of top books about this for a general reader, for people who came to the period thinking, was there a republic? What was it like? I wouldn't have even known it was called a republic. So I wanted to tell the story as clearly as possible. I wanted to bring the period alive, not just its huge variety of fascinating characters, but also the ideas that animated this time and the sheer dynamism of the great Republican experiment. I was as interested in what the weather was like as in the constitutional twists and turns, as interested in where a character lived and what they liked to do, as in his or her response to the world in which he or she found himself, herself. This was actually incredibly difficult, often trying to work out what the weather was like or where someone lived, hours and hours of sort of rabbit holes of trying to just to set the scene, because I really felt that I wanted to get behind the moment, to give a sense of what it was actually like to be in the country, different parts of the country during these years. I also wanted to understand why the Republic didn't last, and try to understand why, as one 17th century commentator put it, this country remained so wholly addicted to monarchical government. When I told a colleague I was writing about the 1650s, he worked on the seemingly much more glamorous Tudors, as did I, used to work on the glamorous Tudors. This colleague looked at me aghast. Why? It was no fun then. And when I told a friend I was working on the period of the British Republic, she looked really surprised. I'm not sure I ever knew there was a republic, she said. Where are the 1650s in the popular imagination? Everywhere. Despite good, but not also everywhere. Sometimes I think this decade is not particularly well understood. Despite the notoriety of the decade's protagonist, Oliver Cromwell, who rose through the ranks of the army to become Lord Protector, the period of the Republic is a period that history, beginning in 1660 with the Restoration, has often suppressed deliberately, assigned to aberration or misrepresented. The historians that got going in 1660, as soon as Charles II came back to the throne, began to cast the period of the Republic as a dismal night of usurpation. Many associate the period with repression, military dictatorship, moral censure, perhaps with religious radicalism, the Seekers, the Muggletonians, the Fifth Monarchists, these sects with extraordinary names. Most commonly, it's a period associated with dour Puritanism, hence it was no fun. While for some, taking their lead from the 19th century, Cromwell is a hero, cited in the top 10 of greatest Britons of all time, a champion of parliamentarian liberty, to others, he remains how he was seen during the late 17th century and on into the 18th, a usurper, a tyrant, ruthless and ambitious. Especially in Ireland, Cromwell remains vilified and held personally responsible for atrocities at Drogheda and Wexford in 1649 to 50. The subsequent displacement of Catholics, the huge-scale redistribution of land that happened, the legacies of which are still alive, are often laid at Cromwell's door. The horrible histories version of Cromwell, the stereotypical joyless Puritans who banned Christmas, plays and anything fun, psychotic fun sponges, another one of my colleagues said, these stereotypes persist in the public imagination. Who banned Christmas is still a pub quiz question, and one which I, of course, got wrong. Because it was not Cromwell who personally banned or cancelled Christmas. It was an Act of Parliament in 1647. But the answer the pub quiz wanted, of course, was Cromwell. Not always so Puritan. Look at him here in his rather lovely velvet suit and his cap with a feather. Neither did his son, Richard Cromwell, who succeeded him at the end of the decade, fit the Puritan caricature that has come down to us. This is a really fine portrait of him from the Cromwell Museum. And yet, the caricature, the stereotypes persist. Last summer, Keir Starmer was mocked in the Telegraph as the new Lord Protector of Britain's morose new Puritanism. Serious, rather boring. The implication being, with a headline such as this, is that the Tories, particularly Johnson, are the merry cavaliers who will triumph in the end. I wanted to get behind these stereotypes and recover the characters in all their complexity and inconsistencies. Many were paradoxes, a bit of everything, a bit Puritan, a bit not Puritan, Cromwell himself. I wanted to get behind the historical moment. Actually, I'm going to stick with that one for the moment. The period is often called the interregnum, a pause between the royal acts of history. But, of course, for the men and women living through this time, it was anything but an interregnum. They had no idea that the restoration would happen. In fact, as the decade wore on, it became increasingly unlikely that there would be a restoration. It was not an interregnum for those at the time. There was nothing inevitable about the Republic being short-lived. However much many men and women might have longed for a return to the ancient constitution, it was not inevitable. And whatever side they found themselves on, and many did switch sides, and often tarnished as turncoats, which I think does them a disservice often, because many switched sides not out of opportunism, but because they were unsure, rattled, and thinking hard about what was happening. But whatever side they found themselves on, many people at the time, most people I think, knew that they were living through extraordinary times. They reached for images of excess, or they coined new words entirely. Robert Herrick, royalist poet, described his times as trans-shifting, new word. Catherine Phillips, a royalist poet but married to a Republican army officer, for her it was a scorching age. For a group of Londoners who believed that Christ's second coming was imminent, these days were the overturning days, echoing the Bible there. And a news book, this is the decade of the news book, the first newspapers that just absolutely boomed at this time. A news book in 1649 proclaimed to its readers that old England now is grown perfectly new, and we are in another world. The story begins on a cold January day in 1649. On 30th of January, Charles I was executed in broad daylight on a scaffold outside the Banqueting House in Whitehall, deliberately chosen. The trial, whose legitimacy Charles refused to recognise, had found him guilty of being a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy. He had reneged on his coronation promise, which was to protect his people, and he was sentenced to death by the severing of his head from his body. The execution was public. It was done in the sight of the sun, as one regicide put it. For those who staged it, it was entirely legitimate. The Parliament, however, that had pushed through the trial was not legitimate. Back in December 1648, the Parliament, the Long Parliament, which had sat all the way through the wars, had been purged of any members who would block bringing the king to account for his part in the civil wars. Their refusal to want to put the king on trial meant that they were sent away. The Parliament then became the Rump Parliament, that insult. This Parliament put through the trial. This Parliament was not fully representative, and this was a real problem for the Republic all the way through. The crowd watching this grim ritual, this of course is a very prejudiced, biased portrait, depiction of it. The crowd watching this grim ritual was mixed. Newsbook reporters jostled with soldiers, courtiers, politicians, and poets. A young man called Philip Henry said that he heard a groan as soon as the axe came down. Samuel Pepys, the diarist, was 15 at the time, playing truant from school that day. Who wouldn't? At this time, he applauded the death of the tyrant king. He knew that this was an extraordinary thing to be happening. But he later changed his mind. The young poet, Andrew Marvell, one of the most fantastic poets of the period. If you don't know his poetry, I cannot recommend it more highly. The young poet, Andrew Marvell, may have been there. In a poem he wrote a few years later, he recalled how at this moment the king bowed his comely head down as upon a bed. Later, Marvell would write poems in praise of Cromwell, the Lord Protector. Away from London and abroad across the Channel in Europe, men and women could read about the execution in one of the many news books, the proto-newspapers of the time. Ralph Jocelyn, a Puritan clergyman in Essex, wept when he read about the king's death. He's one of my favourite sources for the period, his diary, absolutely brilliant insight into sort of ordinary man's response to the time, documenting what's going on in his parish, what's happening in his family, worrying about money, worrying about a sore tummy. He's always got a tummy problem with his navel, he says. But he also, in amongst all of this, documents what's happening. And at the moment he read about the king's death, he had this to say: "The Lord hath some great thing to do. Fear and tremble at it, O England." Something was happening, and it happened for a reason. Others could read an anonymous patriot's warning to those who dared touch the Lord's anointed and dared to spill sacred royal blood. This is the first quotation. This is an anonymous pamphlet. "You must expect to have the thunderbolts of God's anger thrown down upon you." So for some, this was providence, this was God's doing, and for others, God would seek revenge for this. Europe was appalled. Holland called England the devil land and the English king killers. Interesting from Holland that it was itself a republic, albeit rather royalist. Even those who had fought against Charles I on the battlefield, such as the brutish general Sir Thomas Fairfax, that's Charles I's words, brutish general, architect and leader of the formidable new model army, even he had reservations about putting a king on trial. He did not attend the trial. And he wished the day of the execution could be blotted out of history. He retreated to his house, Nunn Appleton, up in Yorkshire, and wrote poetry, meditated on eternity, employed Andrew Marvell as the tutor to his daughter Mary. But he too sought comfort in the idea of providence. Although this day was that fatal day that should be blotted out of belief, he believed that this was part of God's plan. But if the power divine permitteth this, his will's the law, and ours must acquiesce. That's the providential logic there. It has frequently been argued that England stumbled into becoming a republic. There was no plan, and they had to improvise. To a certain extent, yes. The wars did not set out to destroy monarchy, but to define monarchy. It was not a popular uprising intent on bringing down monarchy, but predominantly a conflict between royalists and parliamentarians about different conceptions of what it was to be a king. That said, historians have, I think, underestimated the extent to which, during the civil wars, some people began to argue against monarchy as the right, the best form of government. Some declared it was the worst form of government, and some, in positions of power, MPs, lawyers, senior army officers, began to imagine and prepare for a kingless Britain. Even though the trial might have ended, probably would definitely end with Charles I being found guilty and therefore executed, it did not mean that monarchy itself would die with that. But in anticipation of this, a group of politicians really began to imagine and prepare for, well, what about a kingless constitution? It wasn't completely stumbled into. Once the scaffold had been brought down outside Whitehall, things happened quite quickly. Monarchy was abolished in March by an Act of Parliament. The House of Lords had also been dismissed. Both declared unnecessary, burdensome, dangerous to the liberty, safety, and public interest of the people of this nation. Monarchy abolished, not in abeyance, abolished by an Act of Parliament. The kingdom old, as Marvell said, was literally cast into a new mould, as a commonwealth and a free state. As the new Great Seal showed, this is a copy from 1651, the King's Seal had been ceremoniously smashed up. They brought it into Parliament and smashed it up, and then commissioned the new seal, As this showed, supreme power now lay in the House of Commons with the representatives of the people. These are the people in the Commons and the Speaker in his chair. No head bust of a monarch here on the seal. The executive was a council of 40 men. Cromwell was among them, along with some other regicides, but not all the regicides were on the council. And not all the people on the council were regicides. It was a mix. There were a couple of parliamentarian peers on there too, such as the Earl of Pembroke. The seal emphasised liberation from tyranny. As it says, coiling around the circumference, this is from 1651, which is in the third year of freedom, by God's blessing restored. In July 1649, most of the king's properties and possessions went on sale. What to do with all the stuff? Monarchy had been abolished. There was a lot of stuff and many houses. The state desperately needed money. The king had left huge debts, and those debtors needed to be paid. The wars had completely depleted the state's coffers. So they held a huge royal jumble sale in Somerset House on the Strand, and this sale went on for 2 years. Anyone could pop by and gaze at the royal stuff or make a purchase. You could pick up a Titian, a sculpture, some gloves that used to belong to Henrietta Maria, an item of the regalia such as the coronation spoon, which was bought by Clement Kingsley and then given back at the Restoration, and that's the coronation spoon that we saw a couple of years ago at Charles III's coronation. This is the act for the sale of the king's goods. One keen buyer at the sale was the Republican Army officer, Colonel John Hutchinson. His wife was Lucy Hutchinson, Republican and a poet and translator in her own right, a fantastic poet. Her memoirs constitute another great source from the period, her memoirs about her sort of biography of her husband. John Hutchinson went several times and made some shrewd purchases at the sale. He bought Titian's painting of Venus for £600, which Charles I had bought in Madrid back in the 1620s when he was there trying to woo the Infanta Isabella. After a few years, Hutchinson sold it on to the French ambassador. He probably made a nice profit, and it wound up in the Louvre, where it is today. But many other artworks that he bought at the time he hung on to, and he put them up in his country house. He is an example of the Puritan who liked images. The period of the Republic is characterised by constant change. My book is structured year by year as a kind of biography. Each chapter is a different year. But I did it this way simply because each year something massive would happen, which would change the Republic, make it switch directions. It was so fast and so unexpected. I also structured it like this because I felt like we had the kind of arc, the story of a life here, a kind of an emerging infant Commonwealth that was talked about. And in fact, sort of people talked about it as sort of new, young, as a kind of baby that was sort of emerging, coming into being and growing up. And then it morphs into these different phases. It becomes a protectorate. A few years after that, it becomes a different kind of protectorate. Then Cromwell dies, it becomes a republic again. And then it completely falls apart. So over the decade, you've got this extraordinary kind of arc of the life of the republic. There was no consensus about what kind of republic the country had become. And beyond being established as a free state with an executive council, there was so much more to do and to work out. Some wanted further reform of England's political, social, and religious landscape. The Levellers, for example, argued for the extension of the franchise. Diggers wanted the land to belong to everyone. Some argued for a settlement that would restore not a monarch, but a single person at the head. So they didn't want a monarchy, but they did think that a new kind of head of state would work, but not a monarch. I found eavesdropping on the debates, both in Parliament, but also those that were taking place in the many coffee houses that were springing up in London and throughout the country, and the debates that were being recorded in the hundreds of printed pamphlets from the time, and in the millions of news books that are just literally being sort of pouring off the presses, I found eavesdropping on these debates absolutely fascinating. There was so much at stake. And the debates that took place in Parliament would go on late at night. They'd call for candles. The MPs would say, please, we just want to go home. No, the candles would come in. They'd have to carry on working out what they meant by liberty, sovereignty, the virtues or not of having a single person at the head, the virtues or not of hereditary power, whether a single chamber of Parliament was enough. Should we restore the House of Lords? Do we need another house? This was a time that scrutinised power and what constitutes legitimate power and the forms that this power should take more than ever before. Things reached a crisis in 1653. The Rump Parliament was dithering over reforms and over how to hold a long overdue election. This was the Rump Parliament that had been sitting since 1640, as I said, in a dramatic but violent scene. Cromwell, now in ascendancy following his victories in Ireland and in Scotland. He had not been around at the beginning of the Republic. He was still fighting in Ireland, then in Scotland, and then latterly at Worcester. He's now in ascendancy, and he gets really cross with the Parliament. You are no Parliament, he said, stamping his feet, and he called his soldiers in. They were dithering about how to hold an election. They needed an election. This was not a legitimate Parliament. It had been purged in 1648. By the end of this extraordinary year, 1653, Cromwell is Lord Protector. The Republic had morphed from a free state and commonwealth into a protectorate. The constitutional shift was the brainchild of John Lambert, a brilliant army officer, and at this stage an ally of Cromwell's. He was constitutionally minded. Cromwell, there he is in this really interesting double portrait of both of them. Cromwell was sworn in a ceremony as Lord Protector of England, Scotland and Ireland. The terms of his office were defined by a paper constitution, Britain's first ever written constitution, and only constitution, known as the Instrument of Government. This is a copy of it. What was a protector? It was not a title with a happy history. Richard III was once a Lord Protector, so was Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, and he had been executed. But those who defended it reached for the word protection, protect the people. This is what the philosopher Thomas Hobbes had called for, actually. Even though he sort of supports absolute monarchy and absolute power, he actually stresses protection, and he also stressed obedience. But protection was what Charles I was found guilty of not doing. So protector could be brought in, and one poet, George Wither, argued that this protector was much more interested in the people and their welfare than a king would be. Royalists, of course, mocked and scoffed. This is the age of satire that arises, because Cromwell is just aping monarchy, a sham of the real thing. What's a protector? It is a stately thing that apes it in the non-age of a king, a tragic actor, Caesar and the clown. He is a brass farthing stamped with the crown, getting at his lowly birth there. Often the period of the protectorate is understood as the country sliding back towards monarchy, towards a form of government that it knew and that it seemingly could not do without. Indeed, Lambert did suggest that Cromwell should take the title of king, but Cromwell refused. A few years later, in 1657, the title of king is offered again to Cromwell, but he refused. I think understanding Cromwell as a king in all but name misses some important differences which matter, because in them lie a new and, for the time, revolutionary conception of power. Cromwell was a commoner, a gentleman farmer who had found his métier on the battlefield in the 1640s. He had not an ounce of royal blood in him. The office he occupied as Lord Protector was not a sacred one. There was no suggestion that this head of state was godlike, or, as James I had said, represented God on earth, God's lieutenant on earth, or that he would be accountable to God alone. The written constitution limited the Protector's powers and separated and balanced his power against that of the Commons, who would make the laws. His office was elective, not hereditary. Cromwell loathed that hereditary way. He said, how do you know if you're going to get a wise one or a fool? Regular parliaments were promised under this new constitution every 3 years. For the first time, Scotland and Ireland would be represented. They were British parliaments for the first time. And a degree of religious toleration was written into this constitution. Protestants of all kinds were guaranteed the freedom to worship how they wished, outside the structures of an established church, as long as they were not disruptive. This Samuel Cooper miniature of Cromwell is one of the most famous images from the period. This is the warts and all portrait, which is often attributed to Sir Peter Lilly, but actually it's Cooper's early study from 1653, which is this, which then becomes the kind of basis for other portraits of the Protector. It's such an extraordinary image of a head of state for the time. No symbols of office. It's unusual, it's moving, it's thoughtful, it's troubled, it's human. Charles II, when he was restored, commissioned Samuel Cooper straight away to paint his portrait. Perhaps Charles II also valued Samuel Cooper's willingness to paint the man. The poet Andrew Marvell, who sought employment with Cromwell and wrote in praise of him, was able to anticipate both how Cromwell would be perceived as king-like, but also point out, he's so astute, Marvell, that something new is happening here, something else. Seems is the operative word in this quotation from his poem, which he wrote a year after Cromwell had become Lord Protector. He writes, he seems a king by long succession born, and yet the same to be a king does scorn. Abroad a king he seems, and something more, at home a subject on the equal floor. Not quite able to articulate what he is yet, but it's something else, something more, not king-like. One of the ways in which I sought to bring this period alive and to tap into what I perceived to be the restless curiosity and creativity of England's Republic was to look beyond Whitehall and even beyond Britain. Obviously, Ireland, which is a difficult period and chapter in this decade, but also the conquest of Jamaica in 1655, the first British colony to be seized by conquest. Cromwell sent an expedition to conquer Hispaniola. Hispaniola is the one, Espanola, with the green around. He sent his troops to wrest back Hispaniola from the Spanish. This was an imperial kind of crusade, but also an economic one. He wanted what they've got. It was an absolute disaster, the expedition to Hispaniola, completely unprepared, and many, many soldiers and sailors died. They had to leave Hispaniola quickly, and they just made it to Jamaica, which is the next island to the west, little red one underneath Cuba. And they landed on Jamaica and eventually conquered it. So it was by accident that they ended up in Jamaica. Charles II undid many things when he was restored in 1660, but he did not give up Jamaica. And Charles III is still King of Jamaica today. Up in Ulverston in Cumbria, I met the Quakers. From her home of Swarthmore Hall, Margaret Fell, phenomenal, interesting, fascinating woman, nurtured and supported this fast-growing sect, whose belief that Christ would appear privately within and to anyone and anywhere, on a hill, in a barn, this was catching on fast. By the end of the decade, Quakers numbered 60,000. They pushed the regime's toleration to the edge. The particularly charismatic Quaker preacher, James Naylor, was whipped, branded, and his tongue bored through with a hot iron for an act of blasphemy. This was riding into Bristol on a horse in seeming imitation of Christ on Palm Sunday. The Commons spent days, far too long according to some, debating the case of this Quaker, James Naylor. Was it blasphemy? Was it horrid blasphemy? What should the punishment be? Should he be held up as an example? They were terrified of the Quakers. They were very disruptive. But also, did the Commons have the right to judge and sentence James Naylor? And the debates around this are really interesting for what some people are thinking about toleration, but also about their status as a House of Commons. And Cromwell himself wasn't particularly keen that the Commons were doing this. And it's in response to James Naylor, in the case of his case, that he thinks they need to restore the House of Lords, to have a kind of check on them. But this same year, English opera was born. Such are the delightful and surprising and confusing incongruities of the time that I think unsettle expectations and sort of stereotypical understandings of the period. William Davenant, erstwhile writer of masques for Charles I, self-professed bastard of Shakespeare, appealed to the council and to Cromwell's Secretary of State, John Thurlow, to be allowed to put on an entertainment. And he staged it in the back room of his house, Rutland House, near the Barbican. And the authorities let it go. They were fine about it. Eventually, he then puts on the Siege of Rhodes, and this transfers to the Cockpit on Drury Lane, a theatre that managed to escape the state's closure because it was privately owned. It was an absolute hit. It was still being performed in the 1660s. Samuel Pepys loved it and used to read it at night in bed with his wife. This is Davenant persuading the regime that culture would be good for the country. The people of England are observed by writers of other nations and by our own to require continual divertissements, being otherwise naturally inclined to that melancholy that breeds sedition. So he persuaded them by saying, if you want people to obey and not rebel, put on a good show. In Oxford, meanwhile, modern science was set in motion. A group of brilliant scientists committed to the empirical method were meeting regularly, brought together by the warden of Wadham, John Wilkins, who's the author of this book, Cromwell's brother-in-law, and a keen inventor and collector. He had written this book in 1638, arguing that it was probable that there may be another habitable world in space, in the moon. Among the talented scientists that he brought together, John Wilkins, were Robert Boyle, Robert Hooke, Christopher Wren, a young John Locke. We associate these names with the Royal Society, founded at the Restoration, but their work began in the 1650s, and their work was enabled by the climate of the 1650s, by a character such as John Wilkins, who was put in post in Oxford, but also by someone like Christopher Wren, who was there, who might otherwise have gone into the church, but didn't because of the situation. So however it happened, these men came together. The fact that they came together as the Experimental Philosophy Club in Oxford in the 1650s has been suppressed. The histories of the Royal Society like to credit it with Charles II and the Restoration. Associated with this group was also a cider maker from Oxford called Ralph Austin, whose book, A Treatise of Fruit Trees, became a bestseller in 1650s England. It's one of my favourite books from the period because it's so surprising. It's a book about growing fruit trees. And it was a bestseller, went into a couple of editions. Who would have thought the book promoting the planting of orchards would prove so popular? But it caught the temper of the times, a desire to regenerate the land, to plant over the scorched battlefields, to produce timber for ships and alcohol to drink, to release fields for wheat, for bread, rather than fields for barley, for beer. They could produce cider instead. And Ralph Austin, who wrote this book, was a very popular cider maker. It wasn't just all about economics, though. Importantly, this would turn England into a paradise, into a kind of Eden, ready to accept the coming of Christ, a belief shared by many at the time and, for a moment, by Cromwell too. Behind this book, And behind many other books, ideas, and schemes of the 1650s was one man who is little known, if at all, Samuel Hartlib. Hartlib was a child of war, a Polish refugee who came to England in the 1620s. His mother was English and seemingly very well connected, but certainly Hartlib in time came to know everyone. He had audiences with Cromwell. He was given a kind of annual pension by Cromwell. He was admired by John Milton. He was acquainted with Robert Boyle and the group of scientists working away in Oxford. His appetite for knowledge and reformation of all kinds was insatiable. And through a wide circle of friends, acquaintances, and correspondence, he shared and disseminated information about almost anything, from cures for gout to how to brew beer. Someone said he's like a kind of one-man Google. And in a way he was. They weren't all his ideas, but he knew who did have an idea, and he put everyone in touch with each other. He and the circle of like-minded men and women he gathered around him were committed to discovering, sharing, and promoting ideas about how to improve England, how to regenerate the country and kickstart the economy. They suggested ideas to the government that were way ahead of their time and in time would be taken up. Ideas for a national bank, a national health service, state education, paper money, and the idea of credit. These ideas would outlive the Republic and be picked up. Underlying it all, again, is the idea that this would prepare England would be a reformed and a godly place, a kind of paradise. And this is Samuel Hartlib writing. We believe that his kingdom will be set up. This is Christ. Because we judge the time to be near at hand, we prepare ourselves. The Republic did not last, as we know. In September 1658, Cromwell died rather suddenly. As Andrew Marvell, the poet, had predicted, the centre could not hold without Cromwell. One of the failings of the Republic was that it had never been able to agree and secure the protectorate beyond Oliver Cromwell. He was meant to nominate his heir. There was a constitutional change. It wouldn't be elective. He should nominate his heir, and he never did nominate his heir, right up to the moment of his death, like Elizabeth I, who he admired hugely. His son did succeed him, Richard Cromwell, who was largely assumed to succeed, but it had never been formed. There's no formal evidence to say that that's what Cromwell wanted. As the protectorate fell apart, Richard sent off into a long exile. Different Republican visions were debated and proposed. So what happens is within 18 months of Cromwell's death, in spring 1660, Charles II was invited by Parliament to return from exile and become king. So we've got 18 months of absolute chaos and really, really complicated. The chapter I found the hardest to write, 1659 to 60. How did it all go wrong? Why did it go so wrong? Was it Richard? Was he, as a personality? He's been given a very bad press by history, I think. Tumbledown Dick, Queen Dick. Actually, he was much better prepared for office than I think has been appreciated. Was it the army? Competing Republican visions, pulling and picking at the Constitution, the sort of increasing Republican ideas that didn't want a head of state. And it all kind of falls apart. There's also a new generation of people who are tired, who can't remember the wars, actually, and who want, more than anything, a full and free parliament. But something I think that's really interesting is the kind of tradition of republicanism that also gets going during the 1650s. And in 1659, the Constitution is really kind of pulled between two different visions. Many don't want there to be a protector. They think it's too king-like. But they also can't decide between these competing visions presented by these two men, Sir Henry Vane on the left and James Harrington on the right. Different ideas of what a republic could be. For Sir Henry Vane, it should be a godly republic, godly men, and that would make the country godly. So you only have chosen, selected, godly men in government. This was very popular. On the other hand, James Harrington who met, he had a rota club that he set up in the Turk's Head, a cafe in Westminster, and everyone from the time, Pepys was there, Hobbes was there, came along to hear his ideas and to debate in general ideas about what a republic could look like. He had an idea that was incredibly interesting, way ahead of his time, all based on election and rotation. Anyone in office should be re-elected. An elected Senate by the people, an elected Assembly. The Senate is constantly rotating. They propose laws. The Assembly debate those laws. Monarchy would never be the same again. I'm just coming to the end now. The spectacular, extravagant coronation in 1661, despite the best efforts of this to make it look as though nothing had changed, of course, everything had changed. Within 30 years, the principle of constitutional monarchy, the limited prerogative of kings, the seeds of which are in Lambert's instrument of government, became enshrined in law through the Bill of Rights. Another extraordinary moment that saw William III and Mary II come over from Holland to take the British throne. Always looking to underestimate the revolutionary energy, I think. We've normalised this as the glorious revolution. It was extraordinary. The Republic bequeathed to this country the opportunity to tell a powerful story about itself, a story about the tradition and continuity of monarchy. It is a fiction, but one that we consent to. It was Montesquieu, a Frenchman, who in 1748 looked across at England and made the comment, England is really a republic which hides under the form of a monarchy. Thank you very much.